Thus, by the time Dante sits down to write his Divine Comedy, in which the protagonist tours heaven and hell, guided by the Roman poet Virgil, the great rediscovery of classical learning, which has been seen as the cornerstone of the Renaissance, capital R, in the 15th century, had already begun centuries earlier. So, what happened? Well, in a word, plague. Or, in two words, the Black Death. An epidemic that in a few short decades swept from Asia across the continent to the shores of England. The impact of the plague cannot be overstated. Entire towns and villages succumbed. Formerly thriving trade networks were disrupted, cutting off entire communities. Famine swept in its wake as fields were left untended. Previously thriving industries ground to a halt. Giovanni Villani, who wrote the famous Chronicle of Florence, from which we derive much of our knowledge about Tuscany in the Middle Ages, wrote in his chronicle the year the plague had arrived, and he left a blank space for later when he intended to record the date that it left. Unfortunately, he didn't live to see that date, and his monumental work was taken up by his brother. So across Europe, the death and destruction wrought by the plague was to have far-reaching consequences. In art, it produced gruesome images of death and decay, the motif of the Danse Macabre, the Memento Mori, and roving bands of flagellants spread across the continent, essentially whipping themselves or using other forms of self-harm, self-punishment to prove their repentance, as the Christian community wondered what grave sin they had committed to provoke such divine wrath. So the Black Death, whether in the bubonic or pneumonic form, there's a third form they think which may have visited in the 1347 arrival, which is a form in the blood. The plague itself would continue to wreak havoc regularly upon the inhabitants of Europe, and Tuscany too would experience a particular bad outbreak in the 17th century, but it would never again have such a rapid and devastating effect as it did in the 14th century. So in the decades that followed the initial outbreak of 1347, Italy recovered slowly, but it did recover gradually. Trade, agriculture, and industry began to come back, though we can hardly claim that the latter half of the 14th century was politically stable. Italy, France, and England all experienced large-scale peasant revolts in this period. Now, the motivations in each case are complex, but in Florence, the revolt has some parallel with modern-day attempts at unionization, you might say. The Ciompi, the wool carders of Florence, rebelled in 1378 because they had been blocked from forming a guild of their own by the elites and the established guildsmen of the major and minor guilds. So they took the city by force, and they set up a short-lived government. It was very short-lived. By 1382, the major guilds and those elite families we talked about last week had banded together to take back power, but it was an event that had lasting impact on Florentine politics. The fact that the Gonfaloniere of Florence in 1378 was Salvestro de' Medici, and that he had attempted to deal rather fairly with the Ciompi leaders, was something that the Popolo Minuto would not soon forget. Thus, we come to the end of the 14th century. Our friend Petrarch dies in 1374, and going into the 15th century, few Florentines might have imagined that the Medici family would go on to become Florence's ruling dynasty. which would rule with a few notable interruptions, until the 18th century. But through thrift, political cunning, and clever investment, the Medici were poised to do just that. Although it was Cosimo that would come to be known as the father of the country, his father, Giovanni di Bici di Medici, was the one who laid the foundations for a successful dynasty. Giovanni came from a humble background, but with hard work and a good eye for economic opportunity, he had turned his family wool business into a banking one. When Cosimo was just 8 years old in 1397, Giovanni set up a bank in Florence, having learned the trade in Rome at a bank branch owned by one of his relatives. He became active in the affairs of the guildsmen, in local politics and government, but always covertly. Leading men of other prominent families came to him for money and advice. But if Giovanni liked to pull political strings, he preferred to do so clandestinely. It would be eventually the same with his son, Cosimo. If you wish to live in safety, Giovanni told his son, take no more from the state than man and the law allow. Live quietly. The best way, really, to conduct one's affairs was to invest wisely and give freely, but with motivation and direction. So Giovanni was a key donor, for example, in the production of Ghiberti's famous bronze doors of the Santa Maria del Fiore, the baptistry of the Duomo. Cosimo would follow in his philanthropic footsteps. Cosimo would commission Brunelleschi to cap the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore. It was an engineering marvel, really, unlike anything the Western world had seen since the Romans ruled Italy. And as a point of fact, had Brunelleschi not had knowledge drawn from classical Greek and Roman texts on architecture, it is unlikely he would ever have been able to accomplish the feat at all. Now, there's a good deal more about the dome and Brunelleschi in the PBS special, which has been posted to our course website. So if you want to learn more about the dome, you can watch that. I won't go into too much detail here. But suffice to say that the construction of the dome itself has long been taken as an emblem of the triumph of the Renaissance, the return of classical learning, and its very visible influence on the shaping of Florentine life. But Cosimo followed in his father's footsteps in other ways. He continued to manage the Medici Bank very successfully, and thanks to a monopoly on the alum mines near Rome, the monopoly was granted to them by the Pope, the banking enterprise really was at its zenith. So alum is very important because it was integral to the dyeing process in textiles. It fixes the dye to the cloth. Previously, this precious mineral was only available from mines located in the Ottoman dominion, so quote-unquote enemy territory. But now that a source, and a very rich source, was found in Christian lands and so near to the papacy, the textile business, and naturally the banking business, boomed. Though the papacy had long worked with other leading banking families in Florence, Cosimo's head for business and skill as a politician allowed him to cultivate the Medici relationship with the papacy, such that they soon became the Pope's primary lenders. This would have far-reaching consequences. Though he attempted to keep out of the limelight, reluctantly accepting political posts but never asking for them, giving government advice to the leading guildsmen and elite families only when they came knocking at his door, Cosimo and his profitable business still managed to arouse the ire and suspicion of rival families. For a time, he was actually locked up in the Palazzo Vecchio, and he was exiled from Florence, but was always able to orchestrate his return, being able to draw upon powerful connections and the goodwill of the people. His patronage, in fact, of artists and architects, of scholars and philosophers, meant that he had deep roots with the community and really the best public relations team a 15th century politician could ask for. But patronage was also the best way that a powerful man could demonstrate his virtue. Thus, when Cosimo paid for the restoration of the church of San Lorenzo, where all the Medici tombs until Cosimo III would be constructed, he was engaging not only in piety and patronage, of course, but also in a bit of clever propaganda. So he was demonstrating the wealth of his family in a really more than acceptable way. He was in good with God by refurbishing one of his earthly houses, and at the same time was burnishing the reputation of the city of Florence and all its inhabitants by contributing to its aesthetic and really moral beautification. The group of scholars that he brought under his roof were a means of satisfying his own intellectual curiosity, but also contributed to the education of his children and grandchildren, such as Lorenzo il Magnifico. If historians have tended to see the 15th century as a clearly definable period of cultural rebirth, but also as a movement spurred by powerful patrons, looking at the figure of Cosimo, it's fairly easy to understand why. Cosimo's son, Piero the Gouty, would continue to steer the Medici Bank more or less well after the death of his father, but as one might guess just from his name, the Gouty, he was not a figure that inspired or has inspired much scholarly attention, especially when we consider the shining light his son is interpreted to have been. Lorenzo de' Medici, in one lifetime, destroyed the fortune that had been made in 3, in the hard work of his great-grandfather Giovanni, his grandfather Cosimo, father Piero. But I must say he had a lot of fun doing it. He was a poet and art collector, a rather ineffectual military leader, but he was an excellent writer of letters and very smooth with the ladies, though you wouldn't know it by looking at him. And he attracted a group of bon vivants and other accomplished artists, all of which roundly disappointed his tutor, Marsilio Ficino, here, who had really more highbrow academic expectations of him. But Lorenzo was not always so popular with his contemporaries. For example, he initiated a costly and ultimately bloody conquest of the rival Tuscan stronghold Volterra. His soldiers so ravaged the city that the modern-day inhabitants of Volterra still have a few, let's say, choice words to say about the Medici and Florence.